Lucius Plutarch was the high priest of Apollo at Delphi, a Middle Platonist philosopher from the end of the 1st century, who wrote dozens of books and almost 100 essays on topics that stretch from epistemology, ethics, history, and metaphysics. He was a student of Ammonius of Athens, one of the founders of Middle Platonism, and focused much of his life on the topic of religion. In his Symposiacs, Book 4, question number 6, he says, "Which god is worshipped by the Jews?" Now, if you were to compare Yahweh and Dionysus, you could think of a million things that separate the two. Number 1, Yahweh is not the god of wine and parties and orgies, and Dionysus is not a god who wants a grand temple and a high priesthood, and definitely no Messiah. There are definite things that separate these two gods. In some ways, they are almost opposites. You can almost say that Dionysus is closer to Satan than he is to Yahweh. And all of those points are fair. However, Plutarch makes some good points here. He says, the tutelary god called Euius, the inciter of women, famous for the honors he has conferred upon him by madmen, to be inscribed and enrolled in the mysteries of the Jews? Or is there any solid reason that could be given to prove Adonis to be the same with Bacchus? And no man is able or fit to bring the chief confirmation of this truth, but those amongst us who are initiated and skilled in Greek, or chief mysteries of the god. But what no religion forbids to speak of among friends, especially over wine, the gift of Bacchus, I am ready at the command of these gentlemen to disclose. He then says, when all the company requested and earnestly begged it of him, first of all, the time and manner of the greatest, most holy rites of the Jews is exactly agreeable to the holy rites of Bacchus. For that which they call the fast, they celebrate in the midst of vintage, furnishing their tables with all sorts of fruits, while they sit under the tabernacles made of vines and ivy. In the day which they immediately goes before this, they call the Holy Day of Tabernacles. Within a few days after, they celebrate another feast, not darkly, but openly, dedicated to Bacchus. For they have a feast amongst them called Cradiphoria, from carrying palm trees, and Thrysophoria, when they enter into the temple, carrying the thrice. What they do within I know not, but it is very probable that they perform the rites of Bacchus. First, they have little trumpets, such as the Greeks used in their Bacchanalia, to call upon their gods with. Others go before them, playing upon harps, which they call Levites, whether so named from Lysios or Euius. Either word agrees with Bacchus, and I suppose that their Sabbaths have some relation to Bacchus, for even now many call the Bacchae by the name Sabazios, the Sabbath god, and they make use of that word at the celebration of Bacchus's orgies. And this may be discovered out of Demosthenes or Menander, nor would it be out of place were anyone to say that the name Sabbath was given to this feast from the agitation and excitement with the priest of Bacchus display. The Jews themselves witness no less, for when they keep the Sabbath, they invite one another to drink until they are drunk, or if they chance to be hindered by some more weighty business, it is the fashion at least to taste wine. Some perhaps may surmise that these are mere conjectures, But there are other arguments which will clearly evince the truth of what I assert. First may be drawn from their high priest, who on holidays enters their temple with his mitre on, arrayed in a skin of hind embroidered with gold, wearing buskins and a coat hanging down to his ankles. Besides, he has a great many little bells, depending from his garment, which make a noise as he walks. So in the nocturnal ceremonies of Bacchus, as the fashion is among us, they make use of the music and call the gods nurses. High upon the wall of their temple is a representation of the thyrsus and timbrels, which surely suits no other god than Bacchus. Moreover, they are forbidden to use honey in their sacrifices, because they suppose that a mixture of honey corrupts and deads the wine, and honey was used for a libation in former days, and with it the ancients were wont to make themselves drunk before the vine was known. And at this day, barbarous people who want wine drink, allaying the sweetness of the honey by bitter roots, much of the taste of our wine. The Greeks offered to their gods these temperate offerings, or honey offerings, as they called them, because the honey was of a nature quite contrary to wine. But this is no inconsiderable argument that Bacchus is worshipped by the Jews, in that, amongst other kinds of punishment, that was most remarkably odious, by which malefactors were forbid the use of wine for so long a time as the judge thought fit to prescribe. The interesting thing that Plutarch lays out is the imagery in the temple. The vines and animals and gold and purple would be very familiar to somebody from Athens or Eleusinian mysteries would see this and think of Bacchus and Demeter. In the book 2 Chronicles, there is a in-depth description of the building of the temple by Solomon, in which much of it is built with gold and ivy and depictions of the heavens and the sea and many animals. This particular verse in chapter 11:15 says, "He set up priests of his own for the high places, for the satyrs and the calves which he had made." Calves and satyrs are the exact model for the worship of Dionysus. In fact, Dionysus is even worshipped in the form of a satyr. He leads an army of satyrs in the Dionysica from Nonus. And to top it all off, Leviticus 17:7 says that they shall no more offer their sacrifice to satyrs, after whom they have gone whoring. This shall be a statute forever to them throughout their generations. This verse in Leviticus acknowledges an ancient rite that the Jews used to practice before it was outlawed. Right around the same time, Tacitus, in his Histories Book 5, says something very similar to this. In Book 5, Tacitus talks about the Jews possibly being refugees from the island of Crete, claiming that their name Judea is actually from the Mount Ida, and that Asherah is a translation for Rhea, the great mother of the Idaean mountain. The god that was worshipped there was Saturn, also known as Sabazios. He says that Moses, wishing to secure the future of his authority over the nation, gave them a novel form of worship, opposed to all that is practiced by other men. Things sacred with us, with them have no sanctity, while they allow what with us is forbidden. In their holy place they have consecrated an image of the animal by whose guidance they found deliverance from their long and thirsty wanderings, which would be the image of the donkey. They slay the ram, seemingly in derision of Ammon, and they sacrifice the ox because the Egyptians worship it as Apis. And he's arguing that the reason why their rites are the opposite of the Greeks is because of this. But then he says, by their frequent fast, they still bear witness to the long hunger of former days, and the Jewish bread, made without leaven, is retained as a memorial of their hurried seizure of corn. We are told that the rest of the seventh day was adopted, because this brought with them termination of their toils, after a while of indolence, beguiled them into giving up the seventh year also. But others say it is observance of honor of Saturn, either in the primitive elements of their faith having been transmitted from the Idea, who are said to have shared the flight of that god, and to have found that race, or the circumstance that the 7 stars, which rule the destinies of men, Saturn moves in the highest orbit, and with the mightiest power, and that many of the heavenly bodies complete their revolutions and courses in multiples of 7. In this passage, Tacitus is speaking of the Idaean Sabazios, the god of the Cretans, who was brought to Anatolia by migrants. They call those profane who make representations of God in human shape out of perishable materials. They believe that being to the supreme and eternal, neither capable of representation nor of decay. They therefore do not allow any images to stand in their cities, much less in their temples. This flattery is not paid to their kings, nor this honor to our emperors. From the fact, however, that their priests use the chant to the music of flutes and cymbals, and wear garlands of ivy, and that of a golden vine was found in the temple, some have thought that they worshipped Father Liber Dionysus, Bacchus, the conqueror of the East, though their institutions do not by any means harmonize with the theory, for Liber established a festive and cheerful worship, while the Jewish religion is tasteless and mean. So you can see in this passage that Tacitus is wondering why there's so much similarities, but also at the same time, they seem to be almost opposite in the sense of the rites. Plutarch also says that when Pompey the Great sacked Jerusalem, the only thing he found in the Holy of Holies was the golden ivy diadem that Bacchus wears. Both of these sources, Tacitus and Plutarch, being late 1st, early 2nd century sources, are a little late in the game. But if we go back to Herodotus, the father of history himself, there might be something in there that I think might be interesting for this conversation. Herodotus, who's writing about all the Mediterranean world, from Babylon to Spain to the north in Germany and down into Africa, even India, he's got everyone covered. Not that he's correct in everything that he says, but he does seem to know his geography pretty well. And the question is, what does he say about Israel? Nothing. In fact, Israel as a word is never mentioned by Herodotus. Herodotus lived in the 5th century BCE. This would have been not only after the exile to Babylon, but would have been right when they were coming back during the time of the Persian rule of the Middle East. So the question is, how does he not know about Israel? I think the answer to that question is that Israel just wasn't that big. It might have been a collection of city-states loosely connected through culture. Herodotus writes about the gods that are worshipped in this region. He talks about the Egyptian religion, He talks about the Arabian religion. He talks about the Syrian religion and the Phoenician religion. The Sinai Peninsula, according to Herodotus, is just part of the Arabs. And interestingly enough, Herodotus, when he's speaking about this part of the world, he says that there were only two gods worshipped here. Drum roll. Guess who these two gods are? Dionysus and Venus. Here's what he says. He says, now after the Persians conquered Egypt, they established this system of stored water along the desert road mentioned earlier. But before this time, there was no water available at all. So Cambyses, acquiring information from Phanes and the Peloponnesian visitor, sent messengers to the Arabian king, asking him for safe conduct for his army, which he obtained by exchangeable pledges with him. The reason why I pointed this verse out first, this would be the exact route that would lead from Persia to Egypt. This would be the Sinai Judean region. This would be where the Israelites would be dwelling. Maybe he didn't know they're called the Israelites. And this is what he says after this. The Arabians, who regard pledges made to their fellow men with special reverence, enter into a pledge in this way. Between the two men who wish to make a pledge stands another man, who cuts the palm of each along the thumb with a sharp stone. Then, taking a small strip of cloth from the cloak of each man, he daubs 7 stones that have been set up between them with their blood. And as he does so, he invokes Dionysus and Urania. Upon completion of this ceremony, the man offering the pledge commends the visitor or fellow citizen who is receiving his pledge to his own friends and family, who then consider themselves as rightful guarantors of the pledge too. These Arabians believe that Dionysus and Urania are the only gods who exist, and they claim that they cut their hair to look just like the haircut of Dionysus. They shear the hair around the head in a ring and shave under the temples. Dionysus they call Oraltot, Urania, Alatot. The interesting part about this is that the only part of this region who would worship only two gods would possibly be the Israelites, because this would be the time when Asherah and El would be worshipped side by side. Could it be that this is a similar tradition that's not the same as Jerusalem, but maybe a little more south, a little more of a privatized rite with the similar idea, this Semitic version of Dionysus out in the Sinai desert? Urania is the name for Queen of Heaven. This would have been the title that Asherah or Rhea would have had as well. Another interesting part of that passage was the blood oath and the 7 times of dabbing for purification. In Leviticus, it says, the priest shall sprinkle the blood of the victim 7 times on the man that is to be purified. The 7 times is exactly what Herodotus speaks about. The incenses, frankincense and myrrh, onycha and galbanum, popular incenses burned in the Orphic and Eleusinian rites, also found in Arabia for Yahweh and El. Herodotus says when he talks about the Bacchic origins, it is originally an Egyptian custom. So we're already dealing with that region of the world, the same place where the Israelites supposedly come out of. Herodotus says that the Orphics or Bacchans wear linen tunics called calarices, which are fringed with tassels around their legs. Over these garments they drape white wooden cloaks when they enter sanctuaries or when they are buried. However, they never wear wool, for to do so would be offend their religious sensibility. In this they agree with the ritual practices called Orphic and Bacchic, which are in reality Egyptian and Pythagorean. For the participants in these rites also find it religiously offensive to be buried in woolen garments, and there is a sacred story concerning this. The tassels hanging down the garments is exactly what you see with a Levite priest, and they're also wearing white. There's an exact match here. Herodotus speaking on the Orphics and Pythagoreans who worship Dionysus. Now I will describe the way they mourn and bury their dead. When someone highly esteemed in their household dies, the women of that household plaster their heads and faces over with mud. Then, leaving the corpse, they wander throughout the city, beating their chest, binding up their garments and exposing themselves, and they are accompanied by their female relatives. The men beat their chest and bind up their garments. When they have finished performing this ritual, they carry the body away to be embalmed. He says this is an Egyptian custom, and they even use Phoenician date palm wine. In Ezekiel 21, when speaking on mourning, Ezekiel says, "Cry out and wail, Son of man, for it is against my people. It is against all the princes of Israel. They are thrown to the sword. Therefore, beat your breast." The idea of beating their breast over mourning is something we see common between both Islam and Judaism. Isaiah in 32 says, "Beat your breast in mourning for the pleasant fields, fruitful vines, for the land of my people producing thorns and briars, for all the happy homes in a joyful city. For the palace will be abandoned, the crowded city deserted. Offal and fortress wastelands forever, a delight for wild donkeys and a pasture for flocks." The beating of the breast, the mourning over the dead for 7 days. An author named Lysios from the 3rd century BCE talks about when Antiochus Epiphanes raided the temple in Jerusalem. There was one idol, a golden donkey with a man on it. This is an image that looks exactly like Dionysus. Dionysus, as you see in this ancient image, Dionysus on top of a donkey. Once again, we have another match of images. The image found in the temple matches the image of Dionysus riding the donkey. There's actually a tribe in Athens, an ancient tribe, and the name of them is Yaobakai, spelling very similar to Yaakov or Jacob. The name Yaakov looks a lot like the Bacchic chant, Yake, Yake. And also, the wife Rebecca looks like Rebecca, Rebecca. The names of the patriarchs in the Old Testament look a lot like Bacchic chants. Adam and Eve resemble Hades and Iwa. Iwa is the Bacchic chant for Persephone, or Cori, the maiden, who was taken down to Hades by Pluto. And Pluto's name, spelled Hades, looks very similar to Adam. The patriarch Joseph has a lot of similarities to Dionysus as well. Joseph is constantly compared to Serapis and Osiris, who is an Egyptian rendering of the ancient Bacchus. We know from Philo of Byblos that El, or Saturn, has a story written about him that is very much paralleled to the story of Abraham.
Kronos, who the Phoenicians call El, who was a king of the country and subsequently, after his decree, was deified as the star Saturn, had by a nymph of the country named Anobret, an only begotten son, whom on this account was called Yedud, the only begotten being still so called among the Phoenicians. And when very great dangers from war had beset the country, he arrayed his son in royal apparel, prepared an altar, and sacrificed him, and then circumcised himself, and made it a custom among the Phoenicians from that day forward.
And Sarah being paralleled to the nymph Anobret, which turns out to look a lot like Ops in the stories of Saturn and Ops. In Genesis, Joseph is sold into Egypt, just like Dionysus is sold into slavery as well. Both are arrested and put in dungeons, and both rise out and become avengers. When Joseph is in jail, he interprets two dreams. The first dream, a vine in front of the chief cupbearer. The vine was 3 branches, and it barely budded, and when blossoms came out, it clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in his hand, and he took grapes and pressed them into his cup and put them into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph interprets this dream. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up his head and restore him to his post, and he will be handing Pharaoh his cup. The imagery of the vine and the grapes could be possibly perceived as very Bacchic. The next passage, though, I think makes it a little more convincing, because the other chief baker has a dream in which he had 3 wicker baskets on his head, and the top on were all kinds of bakery products, but the birds were pecking at them. Joseph says that these 3 baskets are 3 days, and 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and have you impaled on a stake. The imagery of the grain and the vine are both of these dreams. Those could be seen in the Eleusinian mysteries as Bacchus and Demeter, which is possibly where Christianity might even have the idea of a Eucharist from. You have Isaac, whose name also appears very similar to a Bacchic chant. Iachus. You have Yaakov, Iachus, Isaac, Jacob, and then the brothers Esau, the brother of Jacob. And his name, which could mean red or hairy, his nickname being Edom. And as the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man who lived in the open, whereas Yaakov was a simple man who kept to his tents. Isaac preferred Esau because he was fond of game. But Rebekah, notice all these names, Rebekah, Yaakov, Isaac, all these names sound so Bacchic. Anyways, once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the open famished. He said to Jacob, "Let me gulp down some of that red stuff." In Hebrew, it's Adom, another play on the word red, which is also a Bacchic chant. And it says, "Let me gulp down some of that red stuff. I'm starving." But Jacob replied, "First give me your birthright in exchange for it." "Look," said Esau, "I'm on the point of dying. What good will any birthright do to me?" But Yaakov insisted, "Swear to me first." So he sold Yaakov his birthright under oath. Jacob then gave him some bread and lentil stew, and Esau drank, got up, and went his way. Esau cared very little for his birthright. This appears to be very similar to the dynamic between Pentheus and Dionysus, where Dionysus demands full devotion from Pentheus, almost like a birthright. Pentheus was the chosen heir of Cadmus, but Dionysus ends up taking this birthright, if you will, from him through the use of persuasion, the same way that Yaakov persuades Esau to give up his birthright. So could it be that the story of Genesis is a euhemerization of the ancient Bacchic traditions. And I don't want to say the same traditions that we find in Athens. What I think is more likely is that both Athens and Jerusalem are coming from a common source that possibly dates to the Bronze Age. We do know from archaeology that Dionysus or Bacchus is one of the oldest gods of the Mediterranean, his worship going back before alphabets in Linear B. The oldest mention of Moses that exists in the historical record, outside of any biblical manuscript or source, is from Herodotus of Abdera, who's writing in the 4th century BCE in Alexandria. And he is cited by Diodorus of Sicily, who claims that Moses claimed to have received his laws from a god named Yahweh. And Yahweh happens to be also a Bacchic chant, and when we see his name in the Greek sources, for example, Diodorus of Sicily says, amongst the Jews, Moses pretended that the god named Yahweh gave him his laws. Macrobius Saturnalia wrote, "The sacred things ye learn, to none disclose. A little falsehood, much discretion shows. Regard Yaos as supreme above. In winter Pluto, in spring's opening Jove. Phobos through blazing summer rules the day, whilst autumn owns the mild Yaos sway." Here we find Yahweh expressed, recognized as the title of the supreme god. And Orpheus also says that Jove, Pluto, Phobos, and Bacchus are all one. In these Orphic hymns, the word Yahweh would be chanted, and it would be accompanied with the burning of frankincense and myrrh, and musicians with using cymbals and drums and flutes, the same way that the Psalms of David would be performed. Orpheus and David are an identical match. Plato insisted that Orpheus was the father of Musaeus or Moses, and the Orphics were a huge part of Jewish society in Alexandria in the 1st century BCE and 1st century of the Common Era. The Romans confused Yahweh with Jupiter Sabazios, and in the 2nd century BCE, when the Jews were persecuted, along with the worshippers of Dionysus, there were 2 decrees in that century, one in 186 for the worship of Dionysus to be suppressed, and another one in 148 BCE, where the Jews and Chaldeans, along with the worshippers of Sabazios, who also is one with Dionysus, was kicked out of Rome that year. Gnaeus Cornelius Hispalis, Praetor Peregrinus, in the year of the consulate of Marcus Populus Lanus and Lucius Calpurnius, ordered the astrologers by an edict to leave Rome and Italy within 10 days, since by a fallacious interpretation of the stars they protrude fickle and silly minds, thereby making profit out of their lies. The same praetor compelled the Jews who attempted to infect the Roman custom with the cult of Jupiter Sabazios to return to their homes. Some have even gone as far as saying that the spelling or pronunciation of Jehovah Yetzavot is Jove Sabazios, which brings us back to Plutarch, who maintains that this Egyptian Typhon is the same as the Jewish Yahweh, and the monotheistic Hypsisterians all over the eastern realms of the Roman Empire worship this version of Saturn, whose worship day is the Sabbath, Saturn's day. The Byzantine Greek Encyclopedia writes, Sabazios is the same as Dionysus. He acquired this form of address from the rite pertaining to him. For the barbarians call the Bacchic cry Sabazian. Hence some of the Greeks too follow suit and cry Sabasmos. Thereby Dionysus becomes Sabazios. they also used to call Saboi, and Iwa, and Ya'o, and Yake, and Yako, those places that had been dedicated to him and his Bacchants. Demosthenes says some of the Saboi, for those who are dedicated to Sabazios, that is the Dionysus, are called Bacchoi. And they say that Sabazios and Dionysus are the same. Thus, some also say the Greeks called Bacchoi Saboi. He also later on says, on attaining manhood, you abetted your mother in her initiations and her other rituals, and read aloud from the cultic writings. You rubbed the fat-cheeked snakes and swung them above your head, crying, Iwa, Sabao, Hues, Attis, Hues. And so, in 186 BCE, when we look at the suppression and outlawing of the worship of Dionysus, it makes you wonder, why was this god singled out, and why were these people persecuted? Is this the same God that is worshipped by the Jews? Or both of these traditions come from a common ancestor tradition? So we have the names of the patriarchs looking like Bacchic chants. Iwa and Adam, Eve and Adam. Could it possibly be that these two characters are a euhemerization of Persephone in Hades, and that Persephone, who takes a bite of the pomegranate, is stuck in Hades, which would be a parallel to Eve taking a bite of the fruit and being cast out of paradise. With all that being said, this could be all a stretch. However, if there is some truth to this, it brings a whole new light to Christianity and the origins of Christianity. Because if Tacitus and Plutarch were able to understand these connections between the Bacchic, Orphic, and Judaic, then it's not a stretch to say that the gospel writers would have saw these things as well. Which is why you have some stories that look like mimesis between Dionysus and Jesus. Which is why Jesus, looking like the true vine, as he calls himself, my Father is the husbandman, and I am the true vine. That looks a lot like Sabazios, who's Saturn, holding the scythe, who is the husbandman, who reaps the dead, and he is the true vine, like Dionysus. There's a lot to be said about this. I want to know what you guys think. Leave your questions and comments in the comments, and I will respond. You have just attained true gnosis.